Well, thank you, thank you. And we so appreciate your staying for this last session, or next last session. And it's really, really great to be here at Luma's 9th annual conference. It's always so terrific, great programming. And somebody said to me earlier, it's like a reunion. And it always is, it's wonderful. I am really, really pleased to have Yin Rani with me today, Vice President of Integrated Marketing for Campbell's Soup Company. And Rodney, I want to get, you have a lot of titles, so I want to make sure I get this right.
It's a French company.
That's a French company, exactly. But Rodney is CMO and Executive Vice President of Moet Hennessy, many of whose brands we consume on a regular basis, as we do our soup.
Yes, thank you for that.
I don't usually mix champagne and soup, but today we are going to. So as you know from those great brand names, Yin and Rodney are marketers of some of the great iconic brands in this world. So we're going to have a chat this afternoon about how they're both using technology to be even more brilliant marketers than they are. All right. A lot of people think that today we're sort of living in the fourth industrial revolution, given the fact that there's a fundamental shift in the way that we are exchanging information. And that shift is, of course, driven by technology, which is fueling more customized, more targeted consumer experiences. And also this revolution has led to a lot of changes in your responsibilities as marketers. So let's just sort of begin with an open question about how you both see digital transforming the function of marketing.
Sure. Thank you for having us, and thank you to Terry for a great event, as always. I mean, it's such a big question, because I'm struck by how digital is transforming everything.
Yes.
Digital is transforming business as we know it, and marketing is merely a subset of that larger transformation. I think fundamentally, digital has lowered a lot of traditional barriers to entry, put a lot more power into consumers' hands. And in CPG, we remind ourselves constantly that the C in CPG is consumers. And so I think digital has really empowered consumers to make better choices, have higher expectations of things on their terms. For marketing, I think what has enabled every cycle, we get closer to that fundamental promise of marketing: right message, right person, right time, right context.
And now right device.
And right device. Right. And we're not all the way to bright, despite the many, many years of digital, and many of you have probably given your careers to that exercise. But you can, every cycle will get closer. And what's exciting about digital is that it never stops, right? There's always another horizon. We're always perfecting it. So as a marketer, I think it's both some days quite terrifying and some days quite energizing to figure out how does digital fit into the mix.
Yeah, that's great. Rodney, is that a perspective that you share? Or?
Very much so. I think the only build I would offer is that it's probably reframed the way we try to construct narrative from a brand story standpoint, in that it's so important that information be not just discoverable, but snackable. We have brands that are 200-300 years old, so we have lots of stories to tell.
Wow, what brand at Moet is 200 or 300 years old?
Moet and Chandon itself
was
started in 1743, and then Dom Perignon in 1638.
Wow.
So they're really long lineage.
Well, young by that comparison.
Yeah.
Wow.
So necessarily they need to reintroduce themselves to new generations constantly. And the way in which digital has really sort of reformatted the lexicon has had big impact, I think, on the way we need to think about reaching consumers.
For sure. So how do you stay, with all the responsibilities that marketers have today, how do you stay in tune with what's happening about there, with what's new among these various companies, many of whom are represented here? How do you try to figure out what's next?
I've practically given up, truth be told. No, it is hard to keep up, and that Lumascape strikes fear in my heart every time I see it. Thank you for nothing, Terry Kawaja. I think that it takes a village, literally, right? The village of the marketing team and the agencies and our various partners. What we try to do is always balance marketing fundamentals of marketing innovation. So one of the things that we've built at Campbell's is a more structured marketing innovation process that is much more akin to our product development process, with the same sort of ongoing discipline of what are the areas we care about, how we test and learn and scale, marketing innovation for a long time for us was a lot more ad hoc and a lot more dependent on individual knowledge, individual knowledge real estate. And so I think just by creating some process discipline around learning agendas, things that we need to put into the stack in order to be competitive in the future, we'll just create a lot more structure around it. It's still not perfect because the pace of innovation is so acute, but I think we have a more stable process and mindset to tackle it.
Is process a big part, Rodney, of how you kind of cope with all of the sort of the volume and the velocity of change and the many, many companies, seemingly thousands of them, who are trying to get your attention? How do you feel like you're at least a little bit in control?
Yeah, well, I don't think we're in control at all. But part of our challenge is that our brands are global. And so they have both a global presence and then an interpretation for the US or North America. And so we rely on intermediaries like MediaLink, like L2, I saw Scott somewhere out here, to really help us curate that, yeah, what's relevant. So shows like CES and South by, to a beverage company become incredibly important. We send probably about 30, 40 people each year. And the first question people ask is, oh, are you throwing a party? But in fact, no, we're desperate for the new insights in terms of technology application.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things that I think about a lot is you don't know what you don't know. And so how do you kind of prevent your companies from falling prey to the sort of idea or company du jour or category du jour? You talked about really having a process for that, but does that process prevent you from experimenting with things that sort of fit outside or don't fit inside rather your gates? Is it really an opportunity, or is it preventing you from meeting some of these companies on the innovation front?
I think we have a spectrum of innovation, just as we do in product. I guess Google's famous rule of 70, 20, 10, and I think it's important to always have experimental funds where you can be opportunistic. I think our ask of technology is that it needs to still solve a fundamental consumer problem. So no matter how new and shiny something is, if I don't see how it fits into a sustained business or consumer or communication issue, I probably won't put experiments into it just because it's fashionable. But many of the things that sort of emerge and start to scale, if we see very instant applications, we will use our opportunistic investment to do that. And we were one of the first advertisers, I think, in the world to run a Watson-powered ad unit in the fall because it helped solve the really simple question of what's for dinner. So new and shiny thing, but I was intrigued because it just seemed like a great way of solving a fundamental problem.
Rodney, do you struggle with scale versus personalization? Because you both are very, very large companies, and yet the one-to-one messaging, being part of the conversation when you're an advertiser, is so important. Is that something that you struggle with?
Yeah, I would say so, and I would say it's more of a challenge around intimacy, because we're luxury brands, and so there is a level of appropriateness that we are trying to strike in terms of aspiration. So what we found is that the best way to see a wind way forward in this forest of change is to do really test and learns, where we can put our toe in and really experiment, versus the camels or maybe some of the other verticals. Wine and spirits is a little behind in that we have age considerations to deal with.
Right.
So, but I think we've reached a real tipping point in the last year or so with the bulk of investment now being made in digital versus traditional media. So there's a real appetite for what comes next.
So you have three customers. You've got the consumer, you've got the distributor, and you've got the store.
Yeah.
Is technology your friend in enabling better communication with each of those different constituents, or does it actually muddy the waters because you need to get that personalization at scale?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's a frenemy. So, it's great because it allows us to do an end run around the distributor
Right.
and get closer to the consumer and have,
right.
build a direct relationship. But I think the challenge is that we run the risk, if we don't do it well, of really commoditizing what are very special products.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think that's right. How about you, Yin? Do you sort of struggle with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all
communications.
living through sort of how to achieve personalization at scale, because we're big businesses with big audiences, but for the consumer on the other end, they only care about their own needs. So we've increasingly invested in, the stack and the ecosystem to try to do that. It'll never be one-to-one probably in our world, but it can no longer be one-to-many. So I think we're trying to find the right place in the spectrum to play.
So you have invested in a food tech fund, and you're incubating sort of entrepreneurial experiments. Can you just talk a little bit about that and what your expectations are for the outcome of that investment?
Yeah, I mean, our CEO, Denise, has been very, very public about sort of her point of view on the seismic shifts changing the food industry. And so the company has pivoted, I think, a lot, both in terms of acquisition and entrepreneurial investment. So we started a VC fund focused specifically on food tech. Different elements of it. Right now, a lot of it focused actually on agricultural tech, believe it or not, because we believe that the food...
I actually saw that term the other day, ag tech.
Yes, it's a thing.
Ag tech.
So it'll be at CES next year, no doubt.
Right.
I mean, the food supply chain is very vast, and it's actually very fragile. So a lot of the growth in the food industry is coming from challenger brands and startups. And so I think, like a lot of big companies, we want to participate and help shape that and not always just be on the end of a bidding war. One acquisition or investment that we're particularly proud of is a company called Habit, where it's a personalized nutrition company based on DNA, because we believe that fundamentally nutrition and food will become as personalized as the other experiences in our lives. And the reason we're proud of it is we think that's the future, but the CEO who founded it was actually a second-time founder. We acquired his first company, Plum, which is a baby food company, and I think it's a mark of the entrepreneurial environment we're trying to create, that he was willing to work with us on his second company, and we were very happy to invest in him, and we're really trying to shape the future of food.
And you also just announced an e-commerce platform, a relationship with Clo19.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about in terms of e-commerce for Moet?
Well, it was launched in Europe, and Clo19 is basically a website where consumers can not just purchase product, but purchase sort of bespoke experiences they couldn't get otherwise.
Okay.
So, and they're linked to the brand's DNA, so it's a way of differentiating the brand, but also really creating a community, we hope, online. And
Is this very, very new?
It's very new.
Okay.
It was just launched a couple of months ago, and of course we can't sell direct in the U.S., so
Right.
we're watching from a distance.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question about talent. If you think about phrases we never hear anymore, brand steward. Remember growing up in marketing, and the CMO was the brand steward, and those days are so gone. They are so gone. So let's talk a little bit about who is successful as a marketer these days, and what are the kinds of skill sets that are required of the folks who work with you, for you, around you? What's really different from when you grew up in this world?
I mean, I think for me, one of the biggest competitive advantages for a person and for a business is agility. I mean, the ability to be flexible and a bit ambidextrous of, when our pre-call we talked about the balance between art and science.
Yes.
And I think it really is that. It's always going to be both. One side is not more important than the other. And so even if you as an individual lean one way or the other, I think it's important to construct an organization and a culture that celebrates, nurtures, and trains both.
That's not always very easy, though, because if you think about, we're 22 years into the digital revolution, and I know that I have felt for about 18 of those 22 years that I was sitting in a science, math, and technology class, and that art was not at all appreciated. So I feel like we're moving back to center a little bit, but I think it depends on what environment,
Clearly, because we probably come at the equilibrium from the other end.
That's right.
In that we probably skew on the art side. If you looked historically, people who really were imbued in culture and in style and fashion, and now it's changed much more. It's much more analytical. So I think in addition to agility, we're really interested in people who can think critically in creative ways, because much of this is charting new territory.
I actually think one of the unsung skill sets of the future will be integration. How do you bring the jigsaw puzzle together? I just don't think there's one answer, and I think it takes a certain mindset to solve. It's not a linear exercise anymore. I always use the analogy of, great senior leaders are often the great corporate athletes, but they were trained to run the triathlon, right? You bike, run, and swim. And modern marketing is much more like mixed martial arts, right? It's like hand-to-hand and fluid, and so your muscles are in good shape, but you're learning a different sport. So
how do you, unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, if you can believe it. How do you plan to stay relevant? You yourselves, your brands, your organizations, what's it going to take to stay relevant? Because we're not slowing down at all. And, I always think the volume of change, the velocity of change, either one alone would be stunning, but the combination of both of them, and it's unceasing. So when you think about staying relevant as executives and as brands, how are you going to address that?
Well, for us, and I think Clo 19 might be an expression of this, it's kind of a confluence of the authenticity of the brand coming from experience.
Right.
And so in the US, we do about 14,000 activations, we call them, or consumer experiences. And what's interesting is that with technology now, there are opportunities to leverage AI or VR to really enrich them. So what we once thought was siloed and distinct from the digital world is now quite integrated, but we still see it as an essential element of really creating something meaningful around the brand.
Yeah. Ian, how do you think about that?
I think we try to anchor ourselves in our purpose that we see as sustained and universal and persistent, and then commit to learning our way to the future and trying to balance those two forces. And we always talk about business as being a marathon run as a series of sprints. So I do think that's how we will be relevant, never losing sight of who we are, but finding new ways to express that.
Well, fantastic. Wow, that was really fast. Sorry about that. But again, thank you for joining us so late in the day. Thank you so much, Rodney. Thank you so much, Yin.
Thank you.
Thank you.